All right, our next presentation will address the priorities and focus of the new Biden administration with regards to safety and compliance. We're pleased to welcome Eric Conn for this session. Eric is a founding partner of Conn, Maciel, Carey, and chair of the firm's National OSHA Workplace Safety Practice Group in Washington, D.C. His practice focuses exclusively on issues involving occupational safety and health law. Before launching his own OSHA practice, Mr. Conn practiced for more than a decade alongside the former first general counsel of the OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Review Commission. And I'd also like to add, too, obviously, I've had a great experience working with Eric over the probably the last 10 years since I've been with the association, and I know he's also represented in GFA and many of our members. So thank you.
Yeah, it's risky to clap before I've said anything. You're committed now. I appreciate that. I can't tell you how excited I am to be here, to be in a room with real three-dimensional people. You know, very unlikely we're going to have dogs barking in the background. Very unlikely the leaf blower is going to be going off. But it's not all good news. I had to put on real big boy pants today, but it was worth it to come see everybody in person and to talk about what's going on at OSHA. And it's, you know, change is the motto of the day today, it sounds like, from Steve's discussion just a minute ago. Obviously, things are changing significantly at OSHA in Washington, D.C. We're transitioning to a different administration, and that always brings very significant change at OSHA. So Jess and I thought it would be a good idea to spend a little time today talking about sort of where are OSHA's priorities right now, where are they headed over the course of this the next few years. So OSHA under a Biden administration. We'll talk a little bit about the people, the organizational changes who are moving into place to make decisions and set policies for the agency. And then I think, you know, because it's 2021, I'm contractually obligated to talk about COVID-19 for at least 20% of my discussion today. So we'll do that because that is really kind of OSHA's top priority still right now. And they'll be spending a lot of the rest of 2021 focused on that. So we'll get into how that impacts the grain industry and what the agency is really doing on that front. And then we'll get into all the non-COVID stuff. What does OSHA enforcement outside of the COVID realm look like right now? Where do we expect it's headed? And then are there any regulatory changes, rulemaking changes we can expect from OSHA that are outside of that COVID context? So jumping right in with the organizational updates, and it's a mix of anybody from OSHA in the room before I start talking about our friends at OSHA? All right, good. All right, this is safe, and you guys will keep this between us. There's good news and bad news with some of the personnel that we're seeing come into the administration. You know, it's a transition from a Republican administration to a Democratic administration, and that usually means an increase in enforcement mentality, decrease in compliance assistance and cooperative programs. We might not see quite the big pendulum swing this go-around that we've seen in years past. One reason is, you all are in that safety space, you paid attention to this, we never had a head of OSHA during the entire four-year presidential term of Donald Trump. There was a nominee, a great nominee, who would have been a great head of OSHA, but he never got a vote by the full Senate and eventually sort of gave up and said, I appreciate the nomination, I'm going to go retire now instead. And so we never had somebody in that top job. And so you had largely the career folks at OSHA running the agency, and the career folks at OSHA tend to operate a little bit more like a Democratic administration. So even during the Trump administration, OSHA was still, I would say, more on balance thinking about enforcement over education and compliance assistance. So we're not going to see a big pendulum swing, which is good news. The other good news is the fellow that's sitting in the top job right now, the acting assistant secretary, is about as good as I think you could ever get in a Democratic administration from an employer's perspective. Jim Frederick is an old friend of mine. Maybe that's why I think he's a good pick, but I'll tell you why I think he's going to be good in this job. He has the reason why he got the job, you know, from Joe Biden, is he's got great union credentials. He spent decades with the United Steelworkers, kind of running, and he was number 2 really at the safety program for the steelworkers. That's why he gets the nomination. But he's not a guy that went straight from the union to this agency job, he spent a few years doing basically management consulting, working with employers. So if he did have maybe a few decades of thinking, hey, all employers are evil, he washed his hands of that a little bit when he started working with employers. And he's doing work with us. He was an expert witness on some cases with mine and working with some of our clients to help enhance their safety programs. So he's got, he's heard the employer's perspective, which you don't typically see from a nominee to OSHA during a Democratic administration. David Michaels, almost 8 full years during the Obama administration, was in academia, was with unions, was with other agencies, really never had that employer's perspective. Jim brings that, and I think that's going to be really helpful to everybody. And he's a bona fide safety guy. He was on a dozen different committees with some of these standard-setting agencies. Reasonable guy. I think we're going to like the role that he plays. So he's in there as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for OSHA, which is a political appointment that does not require Senate confirmation, which is why he's already in the job. I don't want to say bad news because I don't want to insult anybody, but the scary news, I suppose, for employers is the nominee to head the agency. This would be something of a pendulum swing, even from an empty seat that we saw at OSHA for the last 4 years. Doug Parker has been nominated to run OSHA, to run federal OSHA. Doug Parker right now is the head of Cal-OSHA, California's state plan organization. Before that, he was with the Mine Safety Agency for the Obama-Biden administration, and before that, a series of jobs with big national unions as lawyers for unions and working with unions in various capacities. In his time at Cal-OSHA, he's been kind of exactly what you think Cal-OSHA is, an extremely aggressive rulemaking tenure, extremely aggressive enforcement tenure, and he was there, probably will be most remembered for the work that he's done on COVID-19, because that's happened to kind of line up with his tenure. But California, not surprisingly, was one of the first agencies to get out there with one of these emergency temporary standards. Theirs applied to every employer in the state, regardless of size. Extremely onerous provisions, the most onerous of the emergency standards that we've seen on the COVID front. And I think, just watching his confirmation hearing that he already had with the Senate Help Committee, he talked about, this was like 2 months ago, not even 2 months ago, and he was up there talking about how, we haven't finished the fight yet. We need an emergency standard at Fed OSHA as well, like we had in California. I think that we can anticipate the kind of aggressive agenda that he would have in that seat. And it looks like he's going to be confirmed. He cleared the Senate Help Committee pretty easily. He's been confirmed before in his previous jobs at MSHA, and I would expect within the next month that he will probably be installed to head the agency. So, you've got Jim Frederick, who I think is a guy that employers can deal with, and Jess, I think, has already met with him through NGFA. He's excited about, continuing the alliance work, and I think he'll be a good ally. And Doug, it'll be interesting to see the kind of approach he takes, but I think we can anticipate a pretty aggressive agency over the next 4 years. So we'll talk a little bit about what they're doing on the COVID front. And really, this was, I think I've met a lot of you in the room. You guys have talked with me. You've participated in some of our webinars. You've probably figured out by now I'm a huge OSHA nerd. I love talking about OSHA. It's my little tiny universe, but it's really exciting to me. And a really interesting thing happened. We'll call it interesting. Maybe nobody else thinks it's exciting. But on the first day in Joe Biden's tenure as president, he issued an executive order focused on OSHA. And that was a huge deal, right? My friends that are environmental lawyers, they're like, oh, we get 7 or 8 executive orders. Every new president issues an executive order about EPA or some issue like that. But this was the first time that a president on his first day in office has issued something really focused on OSHA. So I thought that was a big deal. What it is forecasting, again, this idea of a pretty aggressive approach to COVID-19, but it was interesting to see it happen as such a high priority for the new administration. And it wasn't terribly surprising, right? I mean, Joe Biden's basically his entire campaign was about, getting the nation past this pandemic and approaching it from a workplace perspective, from a healthcare perspective, from a relief perspective. That was what his campaign was about. So he walked in on day one and issued this OSHA executive order that basically laid out 4 things. The first 2 were all about enforcement. There was one basically proclamation in this executive order saying, OSHA, you got to be more aggressive about enforcement from the COVID perspective. And it wasn't really much more detailed than that. I want to see more inspections and more citations, generically. The second piece of it was to sort of guide and shape what that enforcement should look like is I want to see very quickly the agency should launch a COVID-19 national emphasis program. Right? Everybody in this room has lived through, what's it been, probably 12, 13 years of regional and local emphasis programs focused on grain. And so the idea is these emphasis programs are, even if no employee complaints, even if you've never had a single COVID case in your workplace, no reported deaths, no reported hospitalizations, with an emphasis program, OSHA can come in no matter what and look around at these issues. And that's what was ordered to OSHA to go start one of these programs. So let's talk about the enforcement side a little bit. The National Emphasis Program, until about a week ago, really was a big, had to be a big focus for everybody in this room. I'll tell you what's going on that front. But the idea was for OSHA to focus inspection resources, and actually an extraordinary amount of their resources. Their plan was to do something like 20% of all of their enforcement activity in this fiscal year under this emphasis program was intended to be focused on COVID. That's a big deal. I mean, think about all the different industries, all the different workplaces, all the different hazards that OSHA is responsible to look at. 20% of all of their attention was going to be on COVID in workplaces, and that's what this emphasis program was about. It went into effect, I think it was mid-March, something like that, and it was accompanied by a new interim enforcement response plan. And that was an interesting development because during the Trump administration, this interim enforcement response plan was really talking about how OSHA was going to kind of cool its enforcement program. We're not going to be in person in workplaces quite as often. We're going to be showing a lot of deference to employers who are struggling to comply with certain requirements because of COVID, right? Training in person is really difficult. Fit testing, there's no availability for fit test equipment or N95s or any of this stuff. So we're going to, give employers a break. Well, the new response plan that came out on the same day as the emphasis program sort of scrapped all that, said, get back into workplaces. I want to see in-person inspections, and I want to see enforcement. And that's what the emphasis program is all about. I haven't had time to change this top bullet here, but the good news for you all is that the original design of this emphasis program from March until last week involved high-risk healthcare workplaces, high-risk non-healthcare workplaces, which didn't include the grain industry specifically, covered meat packing and industries like that have had a lot of attention, and then non-healthcare critical infrastructure, which did include the grain industry. Food manufacturing and food, basically the food cycle. And so we were on the list, and OSHA was creating these big lists for programmed inspections. OSHA updated the National Emphasis Program last week in conjunction with the issuance of their emergency temporary standard, which, when they issued the Emphasis Program, was intended to cover every industry, and now it only covers healthcare. So they've actually removed that non-healthcare critical infrastructure component to the NEP. So good news, we are not traditionally or programmatically part of the emphasis program anymore. That's great, but that doesn't mean we're in the clear completely. The concept with these emphasis programs, like I'm sure you've all experienced by now with the grain emphasis program, is even if they don't show up because you're the next name on the list, if they show up for anything related to that subject, right? If you have an employee complaint about grain bin entries and you weren't next on the list for a grain emphasis program inspection, they were going to come and do a grain emphasis program inspection. So now, if you get an employee complaint about COVID, if you get a referral from a media source, a former employee, if you have to report a bad outcome related to COVID or an outbreak related to COVID, OSHA can still show up and do an emphasis program inspection. And If they're there because of the grain emphasis program, and they're looking around and they're not seeing masks or distancing or whatever it is that they expect to see in connection with general protocols for COVID, they could expand and do a COVID-related inspection. And they've got, like I said, the intent, the order from Joe Biden was to do more COVID-related enforcement. We know the agency wants to do about 20% of its overall enforcement in the COVID space. They're going to be looking for opportunities at all times to hit that quota, check off the box that we did a COVID inspection. And a great way to do that is when they're out there for whatever reason to expand into that realm. So you got to be careful. You still have to take this seriously, even though we're not on the emphasis program list specifically. And really, I think that's all I'm really going to say about the emphasis program in general for that reason. The last thing I will say as it relates to the emphasis program and COVID enforcement generally is that in the big relief legislation that the Republicans just the Democrats passed through reconciliation, this was like a Christmas list kind of piece of legislation, and one of the components of it was a $100 million gift to OSHA to be used substantially for enforcement, and that's how they're sort of implementing this COVID emphasis program. There's mass hiring going on at OSHA. We've seen a big dip in the number of inspectors over the last decade, and they're driving that number back up. And so you're going to have new inspectors that don't really know what they're doing, focused on this new and novel hazard. It's going to be a challenging environment for employers the rest of this year, I anticipate. Just some data that we thought was kind of interesting as we were pulling all this together. We had about a year, right? COVID kind of took off in around March 2020. So we had March 2020 through January 19th during the Trump administration. What did OSHA enforcement of COVID issues look like? They did about 1,500 inspections over a course of about a full year. 279 of those resulted in COVID-related citations. Only 3 of those were under the general duty clause. That was really surprising to me. There's obviously not a COVID standard. Well, actually, there is a COVID standard today for healthcare, but for that entire period, there's no standard. There's no specific regulation. So we would have expected to see a bunch of general duty clause citations, but we only saw 3 of them. Each one of those 3 was in the meatpacking industry. I think 2 of them were to the same employer in the meatpacking industry. Otherwise, most of the citations we saw were for healthcare employers who did not historically require N95 respirators for certain segments of their workforce, who now they were requiring, or because of CDC recommendations, were requiring masks, and they weren't quick enough to get to fit testing and medical evaluations. And all of a sudden, you get all these respiratory protection citations. So that's most of most of that 279 is respiratory protection and record keeping. And then Biden takes over late January. We've seen almost, in about half the time, almost the same number of inspections already, a good chunk of those already under the National Emphasis Program, which kicked off in mid-March. So really just in a few months, they've obviously ratcheted up the number of inspections they're doing here. Already issued over 200 COVID-related citations. Interestingly, it's still the majority of those citations are respiratory protection, but as you can see, there's 5 times as many general duty clause citations, and I don't think any of them were in the meatpacking industry. It's been a really diverse set of workplaces, employers, and industries that are getting these general duty citations. And the general duty citation, by the way, is basically just, hey, there's all this guidance out there about what you should be doing, masks and distancing. Before the CDC's big guidance recently, it was masks and distancing for everybody. Now it's masks and distancing for non-vaccinated individuals, barriers, good sanitation programs, training, all that sort of stuff. You're not doing those things, and therefore you've not addressed this recognized hazard. And that's how they've largely enforced COVID issues outside of the respiratory protection issue. But still, most of the citations we've seen have been respiratory protection. One thing we are starting to see a lot more, and this is a big deal, is that the citations OSHA is issuing now, we're starting to see more of willful citations. And I think during the first year, I'm not sure it was so much a difference in administration as much as it was, can you really cite anybody for a willful violation for this thing that is brand new and that no one understands and the guidance is changing every day? How can you say somebody knew what was required and intentionally didn't do it? Well, now they're starting to say that, and I think they're going to have they probably would have some success presenting those cases to judges to say, look, it's been a year and a half now. Everybody basically understands the general controls and protocols that will protect your workers, and you're flouting them. The willful cases we have seen have been really egregious, though, and I anticipate that nobody in this room is having issues like that. The one, I'll just, as a story, because it's kind of interesting, is a tax preparation service, one of these like Liberty Tax or something like that, up in Massachusetts. The owner of this, it's a franchise, but the owner of this particular business was a denier, right? COVID is fake. All this stuff is bogus, anti-vaxxer, anti-mask, anti-COVID, the whole thing, and was prohibiting her employees from wearing masks and distancing, and prohibiting customers that came in for tax services from wearing masks and distancing. And it was apparently incredibly aggressive with OSHA during the inspection, and that was the first willful citation we saw on this. So I think the takeaway there is, whatever your real thoughts are about the situation, you put on the show for OSHA, you handle it like you'd handle a grain emphasis program inspection, and at the very least, you shouldn't be facing one of these willful violations. But that was a pretty crazy situation up there. The other two major components of Biden's executive order related to policy, basically, guidance and rulemaking. And the first was, I want to see a big update to COVID-related guidance. And this was, I think, kind of a critique of the guidance that OSHA had been issuing during the Trump administration. There was a sense that the guidance was really squishy. Guidance is never technically mandatory, but the guidance that we were seeing during the prior administration was particularly soft. Consider this, evaluate this where it's possible. And I think there was some criticism of that on the left. And so when the Biden administration came in, they said, I want to see guidance that sounds a little bit more mandatory. And then also, it's been months now, and the science has evolved quite a bit. So let's get current with where the CDC is right now. And OSHA did that almost immediately, within about 10 days. It's almost as though they had been writing it in the background, waiting for this new administration to come in and take off the shackles. And they did, and they issued more aggressive, more onerous guidance within about 10 days of Biden's inauguration. And they've updated it again just about a little less than a month ago. And we'll talk about that new guidance in just a minute. The other thing that the executive order did was to say, all right, OSHA, I know that you considered whether to issue an emergency temporary standard during the prior administration. I want you to reconsider it. And reading between the lines, I don't think Biden wanted to come in and say, thou shalt issue an emergency standard. He wanted it to be the decision of the experts at OSHA, but reading between the lines, he was basically telling OSHA to do this. And he said, I want you to reconsider it, and if you're going to do it, I want to see it get done by the middle of March, and make all the state plans do it, and let's get on this. Remember, this is January 20th, right about the time that the vaccine was starting to roll out. So what has happened with this emergency rulemaking? There was a proposed emergency standard that was delivered to OSHA, not delivered to OSHA, that was delivered to the White House, the Office of Management and Budget at the White House, on April 27th. And it was shrouded in mystery, right? It's an emergency rulemaking, so this isn't one of these things where we get to see the rule and comment on the rule and have an input in the rule. We tried to, and we wrote comments about what we imagined might be in the rule, and we met with the agency, and we met with the White House to talk about it, and I know that NGFA was involved in all that as well. But we know, despite shrouding in mystery, we know from our friends at OSHA, and now it's actually been revealed, the original proposed rule applied to everybody. Everybody. I mean, an employer that has one employee, an employer in an industry that just works at computers and a desk, at traditional office jobs. There was no industry that was essentially exempted from this rule, and it was really onerous. There was no recognition of vaccination status, what effect that might have on the requirements. It was an aggressive rule that applied to everybody. And this was, 3 months into the rollout of the vaccination program. And if you looked at the package that OSHA delivered to the White House, it said OSHA has determined that employee exposure to COVID-19 presents a grave danger in every shared workplace in the United States. And they had data and they did all this stuff to back up the idea that we need an aggressive emergency standard for all industries. And that's where the agency was. But it sat there at OMB for a couple of weeks. We thought probably 2 weeks they're going to issue this final rule, and then 3 weeks, and then 4 weeks. And meanwhile, we're flooding the White House with requests for meetings to come in and talk about how, we don't need this rule. Certain industries don't need to be covered by this rule. It doesn't need to be aggressive like California's rule and all this sort of stuff. And the agency, or not the agency, but the White House basically hosted over 50 meetings with stakeholders talking about a rule that no one had seen at that point, which was pretty interesting. And that was the second most, they call stakeholder meetings, that any OSHA regulation has ever had for a rule that no one had seen. And meanwhile, what's happening between January 20th, April, and now 6 weeks later? The vaccine rollout is happening, and it's working. I mean, we're watching case numbers falling off a cliff all across the country. Great news, right? We're watching the CDC update its guidance to say, you know what? Vaccinated individuals are safe. They're not unlikely to spread it to others, very likely to get it. And if they get it, it's not going to be serious cases. So, vaccinated people don't need to follow any of these protocols anymore. That's what the CDC is saying while there's this super aggressive rule sitting at the White House about to be issued. And then the agency and the White House were taking all these meetings and hearing from interested stakeholders to say, you don't need this rule, you definitely don't need an aggressive rule. So what happens? This is one of these rare occurrences where I think maybe we were heard. And they decided it would be either a terrible move politically to issue a big aggressive rule that covers all industries, or they followed the science, or they listened to industry. But whatever happened, on June 10th, they finally revealed the rule, and a rule like this NEP that was intended to cover you does not cover you. Great news. It is a rule that is focused only on the healthcare industry. It's still super aggressive, but it applies only to healthcare and healthcare support services. That's excellent. The decision to limit the ETS, I will share this one little nugget because I can't leave without leaving you all scared and paranoid. The decision that OSHA made to limit the rule only to healthcare has been challenged already in federal court in the DC Circuit. One of the big national unions that's been super aggressive sued OSHA during the Trump administration to try to force them to issue an emergency rule, has now sued OSHA during the Biden administration to say, this rule is too narrow. You determined that this was a grave risk in all workplaces, and then you left all these other industries out to dry. So we believe that decision was arbitrary and capricious. You need to reevaluate that and extend this rule to all industries. If they prevail, if the DC Circuit says you're right, this decision was arbitrary and capricious, this rule could come back around and apply to all industries. So we're working on trying to stop that from happening. The interesting situation here is OSHA is going to be the one to defend that decision. And I don't know if their heart's really going to be in it, right? Because OSHA wanted this rule to apply to everybody. I think their arm was twisted by the White House to narrow it. So we're nervous that OSHA is not really going to defend that decision very vigorously. So we might try to intervene in that case and defend OSHA's decision, which I've never done before. Usually their decisions are terrible. But we'll see what happens with this one. But the interesting thing that happened was, on the day that OSHA revealed that standard and said, hey, good news, the standard only applies to healthcare, they also revealed guidance, new guidance that applies for everybody. And what we know now is that that guidance was intended originally to be a rule, right? It was written as a rule to apply to all industries. They had to change things up and say, okay, the rule itself is only going to cover healthcare. Let's take this rule that we wrote for everybody else and just call it guidance. Well, I don't really love that, because you've got guidance that was written to be very much like a regulation. It's issued at the exact moment that you've got this active national emphasis program going on and a $100 million gift from Congress to OSHA to do more enforcement. It doesn't really feel like guidance to me. It feels like a rule that's going to be enforced under the general duty clause. And that's generally my recommendation to folks, is to look at this guidance and treat it like a regulation, because that's what OSHA is going to do. So what is in that rule? It's interesting. What is in that guidance? I'll at least call it guidance. What's in that guidance? It does three major things. One is, you guys have been living under this guidance now for a year and a half. And the one thing that we were experiencing was the original guidance, and all the updates to that up until last month were do everything exactly the same for vaccinated individuals and non-vaccinated individuals, and regardless of what industry you're in, there's got to be this aggressive protocols that apply to everybody. Well, one big shift was, hey, this guidance really only needs to apply to your non-vaccinated individuals or other high-risk individuals. And so you've got, and that was I was glad to see that, because California didn't do that. Some other state plans said, we don't care what the CDC says. Everything's got to apply to everybody. OSHA has come along and said, all right, you can treat your vaccinated and non-vaccinated employees differently. The other thing that this guidance did, quite purposefully, was to try to create incentives for vaccination, both incentives for employers to have an active role in that, and incentives for employees to get vaccinated, because you do get some real relief from, you can take your mask off. You don't have to worry about distancing. You don't have to deal with, quarantining if you're vaccinated under this new guidance. So it's creating these incentives for vaccination, which is good. And then the last thing it did was sort of educational. It gave links to the latest guidance from CDC, from some of these other standard-setting organizations about ventilation, and really just kind of provide a single-source resource for employers to find the best ways to manage the pandemic in the workplace. And here's the major suggestions that are in there, in the new guidance. Suggest that unvaccinated, I think I skipped one here, yeah. Provide paid time off for employees to get vaccinated, again, creating this incentive for employers to get involved in the process, and an incentive for employees. You get paid time off to get the vaccine. You get paid time off if you have a bad reaction to the vaccine and need a day or two off from work. It's not a requirement. It's a recommendation in the guidance. And OSHA will be looking for the ways that you've, as an employer, kind of created an atmosphere that is conducive to vaccination. They talk about continuing the quarantine program, but only for non-vaccinated individuals or a vaccinated individual who is experiencing sort of overt COVID symptoms would still need to quarantine. And then obviously anybody that tests positive, even if they were vaccinated, would need to isolate as the CDC has recommended. Implementing physical distancing, but only for non-vaccinated individuals. And the agency has actually been pretty clear about that the distancing they're talking about is non-vaccinated to non-vaccinated. So you could have, and people are asking me all kinds of questions about, all right, what do we do in our conference rooms now? Do we have to take chairs out like we were for the last year? Can we put people in there together? What about capacities? And OSHA has been pretty clear that you can have a non-vaccinated individual a foot away from a vaccinated individual as long as you're keeping two non-vaccinated people apart from each other. So it's clear that this is really focused just on non-vaccinated folks. And here's the big issue. How do you do any of this, enforcing masks for non-vaccinated individuals, enforcing distancing for non-vaccinated individuals, if you don't know your workforce's vaccination status? And that is just an incredibly sensitive area that OSHA, I think, really copped out and talks about enforcing these things, but is totally silent in the guidance about verification of vaccine status. Like, we don't want to wade into that because it's really unpopular, but we're going to tell you you've got to enforce these requirements on non-vaccinated individuals. So I am reading into OSHA's guidance an expectation of some effort to verify vaccination status. And that is an incredibly unpleasant thing that I know a lot of employers are trying to avoid at all costs. One thing is very clear, though, even if you look at the emergency standard that OSHA issued for healthcare, even in that setting, there is not an expectation that you are taking vaccine cards, that you're even looking at vaccine cards to verify. It seems like it is good enough to OSHA in any setting to basically just ask the question. Vaccinated, yes or no, don't go beyond that. If somebody's not willing to answer, that's fine, they don't have to answer, but the expectation is you're doing something to verify status, right? We asked the question, we wrote down, we've got a list that we're keeping private just for our management to enforce these protocols. That seems to be what OSHA is expecting right now, and that's where the agency is. They're still expecting that you're providing and enforcing that face covering requirement for non-vaccinated workers. And as I say, there's this implicit expectation that you're going to attempt to verify. One thing that I read that was pretty interesting today was in there's a compliance guide that came along with the updated National Emphasis Program, and there is some suggestion in there. It is worded incredibly poorly. It is very confusing, but one of the things that I thought I was reading and understanding was that you might be able to get by with this verification status issue just by telling your employees very directly, here's what our expectation is. You are wearing a mask if you are not vaccinated. And then it seems like kind of an honor code might be okay there. If that's something you want to explore, let me know, and I'll point you to where OSHA has spoken to this, and we can try and parse it together. But my takeaway before reading that was they want to see some effort, even a mild effort to just ask the question, and that's where I think the agency is. A couple other interesting things here is they are still talking about routine cleaning and disinfection, but the guidance is very clear, and this is very good news, that this concept of disinfection is way less of an expectation than it was last year. There was, I think, a misunderstanding about the risk of surface transmission of COVID-19, where everybody was buying these fancy chemicals on a special list of this will take out COVID-19. You've got to use this all over the place. Every shared tool, every common work area, use it multiple times a day. There's recognition now that that's not such a risk of surface transmission. And so the only time that OSHA expects you to be using disinfection, right, these special chemicals, is if you had a confirmed case in the workplace and you knew about, and you know about it within 24 hours, that you disinfect that individual's workstation if you know about it within 24 hours. Beyond that, just cleaning is what they're looking for. Regular old soap and water cleaning on a regular basis, at least once a day in areas that are high-touch areas. If you've got, a control panel that multiple employees are using, tools that are being shared among the workforce, or common work areas, that you are cleaning those, but not necessarily with any kind of fancy chemicals. And that's really the gist of, and the last thing I will say is that ventilation has still been a big focus of the agency. It's a huge focus in the emergency rule. In the guidance for non-healthcare employers, OSHA talks about maintaining existing ventilation systems, not necessarily upgrading anything, not necessarily enhancing anything, but making sure that your air movement is operating as it was designed and originally installed at your facilities. So look into that if you haven't already. So I've met my contractual obligation to talk about COVID. Let's talk about something else exciting. I include this slide every year just because it's worth pointing out that every year now, OSHA's maximum civil penalty authority goes up. Doesn't go up by much. It goes up by exactly the amount of the consumer price index increase over the course of the last year, usually somewhere between 1% and 2%. But many of you who've been practicing in this field or working in the safety field for a long time remember that OSHA's max penalty for a serious violation was $7,000, $70,000 for repeat and willful violations, and it was like that for about 30 years. That is basically doubled now. We're up to about 13,600 for other than serious and serious, and almost 137,000 for repeat and willful violations. So their teeth are getting sharper, so you got to pay attention to that. One big area, and just thinking about this, repeat and willful violations do carry pretty serious penalty. Right? That's no joke anymore for most employers. And one of the things that OSHA has done pretty systematically over the last 15 years is to deliberately find and cite more repeat violations, right? Willfuls are big and scary. Nobody wants a willful. A willful related to an employee death can be charged criminally, and OSHA's out there issuing willful violations for sure. But the real strategy that OSHA has found to make themselves a more relevant agency is to find and cite more violations as repeat violations. And they've done this in a variety of different ways. And it was mostly during the Obama administration, or the Obama-Biden administration, because, right, Biden is our president now. He was part of these decisions, 12 years ago. They expanded all the different ways that you characterize a violation as repeat. They used to look at each individual workplace, and for many of you, right, you've got several dozens, maybe even hundreds of different elevator facilities around the country. Each one of those used to be kind of an individual workplace, and to get a repeat, you had to do the same thing at the same place. Well, they broke down that barrier during the Obama-Biden administration and said any sister facilities within the FedOSHA jurisdiction system where we find a similar violation, we can cite as repeat now, which is a big, big deal for employers with multiple workplaces like you all. They look back further in time. It used to be they only went back 3 years to find old violations to cite as repeats. Well, then they said, you know what, we're not getting into workplaces often enough, so let's expand that look-back period to 5 years. And then they went into federal court and said, 5 years, by the way, is just a policy. We can look back 50 years if we want to. We can go back to the very first citation ever issued by FedOSHA, and if you commit a substantially similar violation, we can characterize it as repeat. So we're starting to see these 5.5 years, 6 years. Well, it's only 7 years. You still should have remembered and done something differently. And we're starting to see way more repeat violations as a result of that. And then we started to see the agency get way more proactive. And I think no industry has experienced that. Truly, no industry has experienced that more than the grain industry. Every grain state has an active local and regional emphasis program covering grain right now. And right now, for the last almost 15 years, we've lived under these emphasis programs. And the idea is OSHA is going to be in your workplace, even if they're not getting complaints, even if they're not hearing about incidents, accidents, and serious injuries. They're coming in proactively. And they tend to come in even more proactively under these emphasis programs after you get a few citations on your record. And the idea is, well, we've got you here, and maybe we negotiated this down to an other than serious violation and you accepted it. Well, we're going to come back and visit 4, 5, 6 of your sister facilities, and if we can find the same violation, this maybe even $0 other than serious violation you accepted becomes $137,000 repeat violation. So you got to watch out for that. And this just shows that this is not my paranoid defense lawyer's perspective of this. The percentage of OSHA violations that are characterized as repeat has climbed pretty consistently over the last 20 years now. It looks like they've been doing this. And now it's over 5%, pretty consistently every year. More than 5% of OSHA citations are characterized as repeat. Big deal. Talked about the emphasis programs a little bit. Just a reminder, they're still out there. We've been trying, through the Alliance and through individual advocacy efforts, trying to convince OSHA to retire the emphasis programs, talk about how successful they've been. It was a pretty dire situation in the grain industry after a couple of really bad wet harvests back in, 2008 or 8, 9, 10, where engulfments the numbers were sort of skyrocketing, and OSHA didn't know a lot about the grain industry, but knew they were getting a lot of calls about employee deaths. So they were super aggressive in the grain industry. And I don't know that any of it is attributable to OSHA's presence, but the numbers got a lot better, right? The industry is a lot safer. And so we've been trying to convince OSHA to say, all right, well, go focus on a different industry now. What you did worked. Leave us alone now. But they're not taking that message just yet. So we'll keep after it, continue to operate safely, continue to build a bridge to OSHA like you've done as an industry very effectively. But for now, just realize that you're on a list, right? Every company in this room right now, represented in this room right now, is on a list for programmed inspections by OSHA, and you're going to see them. It's going to continue to be a meaningful percentage of the inspections conducted every year in these regions will be under this grain emphasis program. And that's certainly not going to change, certainly not going to get easier during a Democratic administration. The inspections that are done under the emphasis programs are done following the compliance directive for the inspection of grain handling facilities. If you've never read that and you've got a role in managing an OSHA inspection or managing and rolling out your safety program, I encourage you to read that document. That document is basically a roadmap for OSHA inspectors for how they're going to conduct an inspection in your workplace. So they're giving you the playbook. Go read the playbook, because it's going to tell you, all right, here's the documents they're going to ask for. Do we have all those, first of all? And are they good? Are they current? Are they compliant? You basically do a mock inspection of yourself. They tell you the kinds of questions they're going to ask employees during interviews. Go out and spot check. Ask some of your employees. And if you don't like the answers you're getting, maybe time to do some more training. Get Joe Milnick's group out there to do some training programs for you and get yourself into a position where that inspection's going to go better when OSHA shows up. They're programmed inspections, plus they can expand. Basically, anytime there's a reason to be at a grain elevator or grain handling facility for any reason, whether it's an employee complaint, a death, a serious injury that's reported, they're going to expand that inspection to do an emphasis program inspection under that directive that I just talked about. You can see the codes that are covered by this. Probably everybody in this room, I assume, is covered in one of these NAICS codes. And here's what the inspections are generally looking at: compliance with how you're addressing these certain hazards. Obviously, it's bin entry, it's combustible dust, it's your maintenance operations, some chemical exposure operations, things like that. One other thing, just add to the list, if it's not really been a high priority for your safety program recently, think about heat illness, because OSHA is definitely thinking about heat illness right now. This has been, in addition to sort of the COVID calamity, an extremely hot year around the country, and OSHA is getting more and more reports about heat illness incidents in workplaces. They're working on, I think they're working on an emergency rule focused on heat illness. So put this on your list to evaluate, do we have any kind of program around heat illness? Are we training employees? If you've got kind of those regular safety meetings, work heat illness into that cycle, because it's on OSHA's mind right now, and you've got a lot of outdoor work activities happening in your workplaces. So put that on the list and think about that as well this year. That's not been a typical subject that OSHA covers in these emphasis program inspections, but I'd bet good money that it is this year and probably going forward. And so you can see the hazards that OSHA is looking at when they come into your workplaces, and start thinking about those and making sure your programs are in good shape. Sort of the non-grain specific enforcement issues that we expect to be high priorities for OSHA this year is looking at increasing budget and staffing. We talked about that already. They got the $100 million gift in the COVID law. They also are looking at another, I want to say $150 million more in just their regular budget. So this is an agency that's generally been pretty small budget agency that's about to get a $250 million boost to their coffers. So look out for a more aggressive agency. One thing that I'm watching really closely over the next, hopefully only the next couple of years, is the possibility of this Protecting America's Workers Act legislation. This is an OSHA reform law that has been introduced in one form or another for 20 plus years. It never really can go anywhere unless you've got Democratic control of the House, the Senate, and the White House, which we have right now. So I'm paying attention to this, because this could be the year that this thing moves through Congress and ends up on the president's desk. If that happens, you'd see a huge increase in the maximum civil penalty authority. You would see a huge increase in the opportunities for OSHA to bring criminal charges against employers and criminal charges against individual managers. Right now, the OSHA Act is pretty favorable for employers in the criminal context. There is the only possible criminal charge is for a willful violation that is the direct cause of an employee death. And even in that circumstance, it's a misdemeanor that is almost impossible to bring against an individual. And so it's rarely ever pursued. You know, it's happening more often, and they're trying to get more creative at OSHA and the Department of Justice, but by and large, it is a really hard mechanism for OSHA to use. The Protecting America's Workers Act is all about making it easier to bring criminal charges, doing it in serious accident cases, not just deaths. Still would require willful violations, but maybe a little bit less of a causation element, and increasing it to a felony to make it more attractive to prosecutors, and making it easier to charge individuals rather than just companies. So watch out for that. I'll certainly make it known if it looks like there's any traction on that legislation in the industry. I don't know if any of you participate in VPP or SHARP or any of the cooperative programs like that. The Alliance is a little bit different. These are for kind of individual employers who have excellent safety records and get some special treatment from OSHA. Those programs were under assault during the Obama administration. I expect the same will happen during this administration. They don't like them. They think it's too easy to get in, too hard to remove employers that participate in those things, and they provide too much relief. You're exempt from a lot of programmed inspections and things like that. I would expect to see that program under assault again the next few years. I do expect to see some effort to find and bring more criminal cases. I think there's going to be a lot more activity in the whistleblower front. They're growing that program. This is where employees complain about safety, and right now, in particular, during the pandemic, we've seen something like over 100,000 employee complaints across the country about the way employers are responding to the pandemic. And you know, we also saw an economy that was is crippled by the pandemic. So you got employees complaining about it, and a lot of people losing their jobs at the same time. There is an absolute flood of whistleblower complaints, retaliation complaints, sitting at OSHA right now. So this is going to be a big focus of the agency right now. So be careful about how you're dealing with employee complaints. It may not even feel like a traditional employee complaint. You just have to be very mindful that OSHA is extremely focused on retaliation right now, and make sure that you're paying attention to that as you're making employment decisions. And one last thing that I think we can definitely expect to see, we're already seeing it, is a return to a rise in what I call regulation by shaming. And I didn't invent this term. This is not my jaded defense lawyer's term again. David Michaels, former head of OSHA, coined this term. This is the nasty press releases that come out the same day that they issue a set of citations. The grain industry was really, I think, uniquely called out in these press releases because we were seeing so many repeat and willful violations, and you're being inspected so much more because of the emphasis programs. They issue a big citation. The same day, they just blast you in the media. They say, you know, this employer made their employees make a choice between their life and a paycheck. Really ugly stuff. And we saw, you know, during the Obama administration, almost 5 times as often those press releases were being issued than in the prior Republican administration. During the Trump administration, they were still doing it a little bit. Ultimately, at the end, they had killed the program completely. We saw no press releases at all the last 6 months or so of the Trump administration. Well, they're back again, and it's not surprising. Every single one of these includes a nasty, embarrassing, inflammatory quote from some senior OSHA officials just really laying into the employer. And by the way, these things are only allegations at the point. This sort of bothers me as a lawyer, a constitutional student, to see that, you know, they're punishing you pretty seriously in the press without giving you an opportunity to defend and prove wrong the allegations in the citations. But that's one of the things that we're certainly going to see more of during this administration. All right, our last subject here is what are the rulemaking and policymaking and other priorities of the agency going to be during this administration. This is actually a slide. This is basically my paraphrasing a slide that OSHA presented at a big conference that I participated in right after the new administration took over. And I just thought it was really interesting because I'd never seen anything quite like it from OSHA before. The first bullet in particular, I mean, this is not terribly surprising coming from the Biden administration, but the idea that this was kind of priority number 1 at OSHA under any administration seemed weird to me. Equity, diversity, and inclusion, you think about that's probably something important to EEO, to the National Labor Relations Board, but I'm not really sure how that fits into OSHA, but it is obviously being woven throughout the entire administration, and that's part of, OSHA's mandate now is to help drive this idea, this concept of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I think where you're going to see what that means really is that OSHA is going to focus in these areas where they are, I guess what OSHA would call vulnerable populations. So if you've got an immigrant workforce, if you've got very low-wage workers, that OSHA is going to be actively, looking at whether there is unusually unsafe conditions for this high-risk population. That's the only thing I can think of as to how that might fit into the OSHA context. They've talked about building back better, right? That's one of Biden's mottos, one of the mottos of his administration. And what they mean there, and they talked about at this conference, was this is where we're going to rebuild our agency. This is where the $250 million comes in handy for building OSHA back better. They're going to improve compliance with the OSHA Act. That's their nice way of saying we're going to enforce the heck out of the law, and we're going to get into workplaces and issue a bunch of citations, and then support frontline vulnerable workers in essential industries. This is mostly a COVID message, but I think in general it's that concept that we're going to look out for vulnerable temporary workers and workers in vulnerable populations. From a substantive standpoint, here's where I think we're going to see OSHA very active. It's not here, but obviously it should be on everybody's mind is COVID and infectious disease is top priority for OSHA. So they've done the emergency rule. I think they're still going to be working on a permanent COVID-19 rule, and they're definitely working on a permanent infectious disease rule. But hopefully all of that stays kind of limited in the healthcare space. So here's the things that might affect you all. I would be shocked if we did not see some aggressive action on heat illness in the coming months. We're already seeing state plans like Oregon and Washington. California has had an outdoor heat illness rule. They're working on an indoor heat illness rule. Fed OSHA is going to get involved in this, especially Doug Parker has confirmed he's been enforcing a heat illness rule. He was part of the implementation of California's heat illness rule. We're going to see some activity on this front. This is going to be a big deal for your industry. So hopefully we'll all be involved together in trying to impact what that rule looks like, but working together to make sure we're addressing that hazard. OSHA record keeping has been really hamstrung the last few years because OSHA's statute of limitations that OSHA believed used to be 5.5 years to cite record keeping violations was limited to 6 months, and they've been trying to find a way out from under that a court decision, Merrick Garland actually, a court decision that hemmed that in to 6 months. And I would look for some rulemaking or legislation on that front to try and expand record-keeping statute of limitations. HAZCOM's about to get an update. I don't think it's going to be that big a deal. It's not going to impact you all too terribly much, but we'll look at that as it moves through that rulemaking process. Combustible dust, I would be shocked if that's not back on the agenda. I would also be shocked if we saw a final rule issued, at least during a 4-year term of a Biden administration. But there's going to be some movement on that, and obviously that's impactful on your industry. And then electronic record keeping, I expect to see expanded as well. So I just hit it. This is the first time I've ever finished on time. So, but I'll stick around for questions too. Check out our blogs if you haven't already. The OSHA Defense Report. My mom says it's great reading, and I don't think she's biased at all. So get in there, check that out. And if I didn't see too many heads down on the table. We do a free monthly webinar on OSHA issues, and you can find that on our website at conmaciel.com. But here's the topics we've got coming up, and we always sprinkle in some emergency topics as well. So check those out.
You had mentioned. It's probably okay in OSHA's eyes to ask employees whether or not they were vaccinated in some form. Is there any consideration about proof of antibodies?
So that's a great question. So the question, I guess everybody heard because there's a microphone, are we just asking about vaccination status, or are we also asking perhaps about whether you've had the illness already and have natural antibodies. For whatever reason, and I don't know what the reason is, the agency and the CDC and really everybody is just way more focused on the vaccine, right? I mean, I think there is some reluctance to acknowledge the immunity that is afforded by the natural antibodies, which seems weird to me. But right now, there is nothing in the guidance about that. There's nothing in the ETS for healthcare. There's nothing in any of these other state. Actually, I shouldn't say that. There is in California, so maybe we do get there eventually, something that says you don't need to quarantine if you've recently had and recovered from COVID-19. But I think it's only gives you like a 90-day window that you don't need to be treated as a close contact. You don't need to be treated as a quarantine subject. But federal OSHA is not really doing anything on that front right now. The ETS does not distinguish between a person who's had the virus and recovered and a non-vaccinated individual if that person's also not vaccinated for purposes of masking, distancing, quarantine, any of that. So right now, I think there would be some regulatory risk to sort of categorizing a previously infected and recovered individual with the vaccinated group just because that's where OSHA is right now. Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, we've been talking about that with the agency throughout to say, look, there, I mean, just thinking about herd immunity generally, we should be counting all these folks together to say, hey, we've 60% vaccinated plus, what's it, like 300 million people have had the virus.
Like 30 million affected people 8 months ago, that had their own immunity. That number has never gone up the last 8 months. It just goes up, just a pittance every month.
Yeah, yeah.
It steals the narrative.
I mean, there are studies that show that there is immunity from having had the virus and recovered. It doesn't appear to be as robust as the vaccine, but it's not nothing, and there seems to be no recognition of it. So I don't know. It's an interesting subject.
Eric, I think we got 2 more questions.
Okay.
We have our next session too.
Any concerns on HIPAA?
About HIPAA?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, there's employee privacy concerns for sure. HIPAA technically should only apply in the context of a healthcare employer, a healthcare organization sharing your health information, but there are definitely legitimate employee privacy concerns that are implicating the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that's why I do want to be very clear. If you're doing something to verify vaccination status, don't go beyond the yes or no, right? Are you vaccinated, yes or no? If the answer is no, and you ask why not, you're stepping into a landmine, because the why not is where the employee might have to say, well, I've got this rare illness that makes, that I can't get the vaccine, or I've got this immunocompromised condition that makes the vaccine not effective for me. Employers are not allowed to know that. That's the sort of stuff that you can get in trouble for, sort of probing into an employee's health history. And the idea that you could ask about vaccination status is a little jarring for an employment lawyer, because you're never allowed to ask that sort of thing except for now, because we are in, right, this emergency crisis situation where the concept is, does this particular health information potentially create, what do they call it, basically a risk to the workplace. And the idea is that infected individuals, or those that could be potentially infected individuals, present this risk in the workplace, so you are allowed to ask the question during this limited time. But you can't go beyond that. You can't inquire into other health conditions that employees have.
You mentioned, can you hear me? Yep. You mentioned combustible dust. What's your viewpoint on NFPA 652, specifically 61, for grain handling facilities to conduct it? I know the deadline's January 2022. Do you think OSHA is going to pick that up, and do you think they'll try to cite on it?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, they're already doing that, basically, right? I mean, we see general duty clause citations being issued to grain handling facilities for combustible dust-related issues, not under 652 yet, but under other NFPA standards that have been out there for a long time. I think they're chomping at the bit to use the new the latest and greatest and, doing your dust hazard assessments and all that sort of stuff, I would expect to see OSHA using that as recognition of the hazard, recognition of feasible means of abatement in general duty clause citations as it becomes, as some of those deadlines pass and as it becomes more common that employers are actually implementing those provisions. So if your competitors are doing it, you're not doing it, I think that could be some fodder for general duty citations.
And just to add to that, I serve on the NFPA 61 committee on behalf of NGFA, so I've been very involved in 61, 652. I think what's been going on here in this whole issue, just like Eric was saying, is if you go back to the previous administration, they were trying to use the NFPA standards as a way to implement the combustible dust standard.
Right.
So what they're trying to do now with all the DHA, what's going on, I mean, that's what that means is the authority having jurisdiction, right, when it comes to the NFPA standards. So, the authority having jurisdiction, you should implement that if they say that you should implement it. But the change that's been happening over the years is when you start having, and I don't mean to offend any here, but if the insurance companies, right, they're the ones that have been coming in and stating that, when they do their loss control, when they do their audit, stating if you want to keep the policy, you need to be doing the DHA. Right, that's been the significant change that's been occurring. But I'd be happy to chat with you more about that. NFPA 61, 652, that's a big issue. Yep. One more question I know before we have our next speaker, and I wanted to ask this about you because we do have several members here from state plan states. Mm-hmm. So we have people here from North Carolina, Iowa, Minnesota, Michigan, and so forth. So I know there's, as far as the COVID goes, and the guidance and everything you were talking about, how does this impact the policies within these state plan states?
Yeah, the states have been all over the map here, and just among those that you listed, North Carolina OSHA has been a pretty wonderful partner for employers through COVID. They have been basically saying, we don't view this as a workplace crisis. We think this is a public health crisis, and NC OSHA has been pretty hands-off. On the other end of that spectrum, we've talked about California, but Michigan, you mentioned, Michigan has been, I think, one of the worst states for employers through the COVID situation. They had an emergency rule. They've issued more citations than California, than probably any other state plan around COVID issues. But in general, the states that have acted, right, there's a specific rule or guidance that you should be following. There's other states that haven't acted to issue their own guidance or their own rule. I think you need to sort of look at the federal guidance as an overlay in those states. But that's, it's been all over the map how aggressive they've been. And it's generally, you can sort of follow the pro-employer states and the pro-employee or pro-union states, how aggressively they've handled this issue like any other. So thanks so much, everybody. It was great to be here.